This is A Word, a podcast from Slate. I'm your host, Jason Johnson. One of the most profound times when the personal becomes political is pregnancy loss. And the recent election threatens to make the consequences even more devastating. So what can we do now to protect reproductive rights?
If you're talking about stillbirth, you have to talk about how abortion rights affects miscarriage care. Just bringing all of that together in a more unified way would make a huge difference in how we have these discussions.
The authors of I'm Sorry for My Loss, an urgent examination of reproductive care in America, coming up on A Word with me, Jason Johnson. Stay with us.
For over 50 years, Burlington's legacy has been great deals on coats for all weather conditions. So before you're caught unprepared for the winter weather, head to Burlington for name brands, quality items, and surprising fits for every family member. Stock up on coats, sweaters, and accessories before the cold hits, so you can finally stop avoiding the elements and start living comfortably. Warm up at your nearest Burlington location less than 1 mile away. Burlington. Deals, brands, wow.
Chronic migraine is 15 or more headache days a month, each lasting 4 hours or more.
Botox, onabotulinum toxin A, prevents headaches in adults with chronic migraine. It's not for adults with migraine with 14 or fewer headache days a month. It prevents, on average, 8 to 9 headache days a month versus 6 to 7 for placebo.
Prescription Botox is injected by your doctor. Effects of Botox may spread hours to weeks after injection, causing serious symptoms. Alert your doctor right away, as difficulty swallowing, speaking, breathing, eye problems, or muscle weakness can be signs of a life-threatening condition. Patients with these conditions before injection are at highest risk. Side effects may include allergic reactions, neck and injection site pain, fatigue, and headache. Allergic reactions can include rash, welts, asthma symptoms, and dizziness. Don't receive Botox if there's a skin infection. Tell your doctor your medical history, muscle or nerve conditions, including ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, myasthenia gravis or Lambert-Eaton syndrome, and medications, including botulinum toxins, as these may increase the risk of serious side effects.
Ask your doctor and visit BotoxChronicMigraine.com or call 1-800-44-BOTOX to learn more.
Welcome to A Word, a podcast about race and politics and everything else. I'm your host, Jason Johnson. We're going to take a different turn in this episode and talk about an issue that's centered largely around gender instead of race. Pregnancy loss is at once very common and very hidden. While exact numbers are hard to pin down, it's estimated that more than a third of pregnancies end with a loss: miscarriage, stillbirth, or abortion. And now with the re-election of Donald Trump, millions of American women are more fearful than ever that these most intimate and often heartbreaking moments of their lives will be further politicized, and that the emotional complexity of pregnancy loss will continue to be willfully misunderstood. Fighting that was on the minds of childhood best friends Rebecca Little and Colleen Long, who viewed their own experiences of pregnancy loss as an opportunity to open up a public conversation about the issue. The result is the book I'm Sorry for My Loss, an urgent examination of reproductive care in America. And Rebecca Little and Colleen Long join us now. Rebecca and Colleen, thank you so much and welcome to A Word.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
So this is different. I was recommended this book and read it and was moved. And we've had shows where we've talked about, infant mortality and women dying during childbirth, but this was different. This series of stories and the urgency of it was incredibly moving to me. You two began your work on this book during the pandemic. What inspired you to start at that time? We'll start with Colleen and then we'll go to Rebecca.
We had been friends for a long time, and we had been talking about this sort of in our own personal capacity for a while, just because we'd both experienced, loss and were upset about everything, And I, at the time, was the Justice Department and Supreme Court editor for the AP. So I was listening to the Dobbs arguments on the Supreme Court's website. And I sort of understood from listening to the Dobbs arguments, I think anybody who was listening, could probably have guessed that Roe was going to be at least curtailed, and at most it would fall. So I said to Rebecca, I feel like this is a moment where we're going to hear this kind of stuff. These topics are going to be in the public discussion more, and it might be a good time to take a look at this sort of in a holistic, sort of critical way. And I think also during the pandemic, you're sort of searching around for what you want to do with your life, really. We're like all at home, tortured, dealing with our children if you have children at home. And I think for both of us, we were like, this is something that is really important to us, and we really wanted to do it.
Rebecca?
Yes. So I was home with 3 kids doing remote learning. The youngest was potty training at the time. And so Colleen said, I think we always say this was a book born of text messages because we had always texted back and forth about it. She said, I think there's a book here. And I said, a book about our cursed wombs? And she said, yeah, I think there is. And, at the time, all the kids are on Zoom, nothing's going well. And I was like, yes, I will do anything that isn't this. And there's a lot of memoir in this space. And there's a lot of grief manuals, and there is a lot of religious literature. But we thought if we could take elements of some of those things and make a secular reported book, why is America so bad at this? That would be a resource that we wish that we had when we experienced our losses.
So you guys conducted like dozens of interviews with experts and people who had suffered pregnancy losses for the book. How did you find people willing to share their stories? That's the part that gets me because, again, the sort of premise of this, the underlying thing is it's very painful, very personal. Sometimes these might be experiences that their own partners didn't know. So how did you guys, and we'll start with Rebecca, how did you guys find the people to interview?
So what we did was we reached out to a lot of the support organizations and said, will you put a call out to people who are willing to talk? So there was a volunteer, basis to it that they came to us. But what was really interesting is we got people from all over the country, different religions, different ages, different races, just a really big cross section of people who wanted to talk about this experience. And another thing that I think happened because Roe fell in the middle of our research, and there were people who hadn't talked about it in 20 years who felt compelled to share their story. And so it was mostly those grief organizations, social media, and then friend of a friend of a friend of a friend. It was just put a call out. And then we wanted to get 50. We thought 50 was a good number. And so many people reached out that we just kept interviewing and we got to 100.
Colleen, part of what you pointed out in the book as the reason why it's so difficult to discuss pregnancy loss is that American society divides people into good victims and bad victims. First off, please go into that because that is so key in how we understand people in this country. But also, how did the people you talk to experience that? And what role did race play in the idea of being a good victim or a bad victim when it comes to pregnancy loss?
Yeah, I'm going to start with the last one first. The role of race is just intrinsically linked to pregnancy loss. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about this, but the rate of maternal mortality for Black women is more than double the rate of maternal mortality for white women. So, I don't know how to talk about pregnancy loss without talking about the racial disparities because they're just so massive. One of the things we noticed in our research is that there are people who are considered good victims. Those are people who have been raped, the victims of incest, people who are in sort of terrible circumstances that they could never have put themselves in. The bad victims are, the people who are purposefully ending their pregnancies or using abortion as birth control. And I think what we were really trying to expose in the book was just how complicated and gray all of this is and how those stereotypes are just that. And a lot of these complications that people experience that, lead them to the ending of a pregnancy, for example, they have so many elements. It's just very, very complicated. It's complicated medically. It's complicated emotionally. It's complicated economically. And I think we were really trying to explain the gray area. We mention in the book, I think it's in the end, I think it's in the afterword, that none of this is about auditioning for humanity. But a lot of this is still in the public sphere anyway. What we're talking about are only the most horrible cases, just the most awful. But people who experience these issues and problems, you don't have to nearly die for it to be terrible. And I think we also tried to illuminate that a little bit in the book too.
We're going to take a short break. When we come back, more on critical conversations around reproductive rights. This is A Word with Jason Johnson. Stay tuned.
For over 50 years, Burlington's legacy has been great deals on coats for all weather conditions. So before you're caught unprepared for the winter weather, head to Burlington for name brands, quality items, and surprising fits for every family member. Stock up on coats, sweaters, and accessories before the cold hits, so you can finally stop avoiding the elements and start living comfortably. Warm up at your nearest Burlington location less than 1 mile away. Burlington. Deals, brands, wow.
Stop. 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 Had enough? Kick out mucus and quiet the cough with Mucinex 12-Hour DM for long-lasting cough and chest congestion relief. Buy Mucinex 12-Hour DM at your local retailer. Use as directed.
This is Jason Johnson, host of A Word, Slate's podcast about race and politics and everything else. I want to take a moment to welcome our new listeners. If you've discovered A Word and like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts. And let us know what you think by writing us at aword@slate.com. Thank you. You're listening to A Word with Jason Johnson. Today, we're talking with Rebecca Little and Colleen Long, the authors of I'm Sorry for My Loss, an urgent examination of reproductive care in America. Rebecca, the book starts with you and very intimate stories about pregnancy losses. Would you be willing to tell us what happened to you and why you thought it was important to make that public?
Absolutely. So I have had 6 pregnancies. My first 2 pregnancies were pretty uneventful, with the exception of having C-sections were fine. So it was trying to have a third kid where things went off the rails a little bit. So I had a missed miscarriage. And what that means is that your body doesn't get the signal that the embryo had stopped developing. And so I went in for my 8-week checkup. And it had clearly stopped developing probably around the 5th week. In that case, they sent me home with, I took what is essentially the abortion pill to kind of get my body the signal that it was time to have a miscarriage. And it did not fully get all the tissue. And so I got an infection and then had to have a D&C. So a D&C is a dilation and curettage is what it's short for. But it's really, that's kind of a colloquialism for what is more commonly a DNA, which is a dilation and aspiration. But essentially what it is they go in and either scrape or vacuum out tissue. It's the most common gynecological procedure because they use it for polyps and they use it for endometriosis. There's a lot of reasons why it's used. But then after a miscarriage, usually if your body doesn't pass all the tissue, which is pretty common, then they go and take it so that you don't get an infection, because if the tissue remains, you can become septic. Now, I should point out that the woman who died in Georgia, this is exactly what happened to her. She'd gone to North Carolina for an abortion, had the abortion pill. All the tissue didn't attach. She was home back in Georgia and then couldn't get care. All she needed was a D&C. It's a 15-minute procedure. And so the difference was I had access to that care. Then it took forever. What you need after a miscarriage is for the pregnancy hormone to go back to 0. And it just took 6 weeks, maybe. It was like the never-ending miscarriage. Then after that happened, I got pregnant again pretty quickly. And this time we were like, okay, we're not going to say a word until we have cleared every, in quotes, safe hurdle, which, I think a lot of us tell ourselves and a lot of us get burned by. So we waited until 16 weeks. We were having our 3rd boy. We had passed all those genetic screens where you think, okay, we'd had a heartbeat on an ultrasound. We were like, it's time to tell the kids. It's time to tell everyone. And I went in for my 20-week ultrasound. And I noticed that I didn't have as much movement. And I mean, in my heart of hearts, I think I knew something was wrong. But I didn't move up that appointment. And I didn't want to know. And I wanted to be wrong. And so I went into that appointment. And I had seen my other 2 sons on the ultrasound. You're supposed to see a spinning little like spirograph thing and a pulsing. And there was nothing. It was unmoving. It's a heartbreaking image. And there was no heartbeat. And I immediately was taken up the back stairs and to be induced. to give birth, because in my case, that was the safest route for me. And so I did, I was able to hold him. And then I had another D&C because the placenta didn't detach, because it's not supposed to detach at 20 weeks. And so then at that time I said, okay, we need to bowl with bumpers. We are going to do IVF with genetic testing, and we're going to implant a embryo, and everything's going to be fine. Because so much of pregnancy, as we talk about in the book, is about control, right? So I'm going to control these circumstances and then nothing bad will happen. And so we implanted this embryo. Another boy, again, waited to tell anybody, and it split, and it was identical twin boys, which is pretty rare with IVF for it to split. And so we were like, okay, we can do this. We're going to have 4 boys, and went in for our 16-week heartbeats. And we said, okay. And at that point, this was my 6th pregnancy. Like, I was showing, it was getting to the point where there are only so many sweatshirts you can wear out in public before people start to notice. And my older 2 were 5 and 3 at the time. And so I told everybody. We went to our 20 week, and there were 2 heartbeats. 2 babies were moving. And so I said, okay, this is going to be okay. And the sonographer stopped speaking. And if the ultrasound tech goes quiet, you are in trouble. And I looked at my husband and I said, something's wrong. He said, what are you talking about? Like, I can see him. And I said, nope, something's wrong. I just knew it. So long story short, the twins had gotten an infection at some point. We will never know what it was. I was never sick. We have no idea. I was tested for everything. We have absolutely no idea what happened. So they had to clear the infection. And so at the time we thought one twin was sicker than the other. At the time we thought that the heartbreaking choice was going to be, do we have to terminate one twin to save the other because they shared a placenta? And that was devastating enough. It was like, how do you make that choice? It's very complicated medically. It's beyond complicated emotionally. So they said, well, just keep coming in every week and we'll hope they get better. I have to say, is torture when you can feel these babies kicking in you and you're worried at any moment that they're going to stop. And I did get a fetal Doppler off Amazon, which my husband was like, you're going to torture yourself. And I would use it in secret. And I remember he came in one time and caught me, and it was like he'd caught me with, like doing drugs, like little fetal Doppler. I was like, they're still in there. So after having so many scans, and I mean 4-hour ultrasounds, long appointments, they cleared the infection, but it calcified their hearts. And so even though they did get rid of the infection, it had left behind damage, essentially. So we were in Chicago, and the cardiologist said, there's a conference tonight. I'm going to bring the scans to the conference, and we're going to find out there was like 20 specialists, because it's a specialty of a specialty. You're talking about, neonatal cardiology, and see what anyone thinks. And he called us at 9:30 that night, and he said, nobody thinks they're going to make it. And so we were at 23 weeks, 3 or 4 days. We were getting close to that 24-week mark. And I said, I cannot stay pregnant just waiting for them to die. It's torture. How do we explain this to the kids? So I said, well, why don't we induce? Then we can hold them again. We can, have our time. We can see them. I've done this before. We'll do it again. And so we did. And from the get-go, it wasn't going the same way. It took forever to induce the labor. It just seemed like things weren't going well. And they just couldn't get them out. I pushed and pushed and pushed, and nothing was happening, and nobody could figure out why. Finally, they did. And at that point, I was blue. I could not really communicate. And my husband is a doctor, and he knew this was bad. And so they thought they had to get me to the ICU for antibiotics. So what had happened is the 2 previous D&Cs that I'd had left a soft spot on the back of my uterus, that there was no way anybody could have known this had happened. When the placenta detached, it caused a little tear. It was like kicking a hole in the bellows. So that's why I couldn't proceed with labor. And so they kept scanning me, but I was bleeding behind. So the blood wasn't showing up in the scan. So I was in the ICU and had a PICC line just in case. And then all at once, it was just this blinding pain. And we know now what happened is that essentially the left wall of my uterus just exploded, my ovary with it. And I mean, it was agony. I remember the last thing I said before they knocked me out for the surgery was, you got to knock me out. So they came in. I mean, it was one of those things where suddenly 20 people were in the room. And they said to my husband, we could do a scan, but I think she needs to go to surgery right now. because I was in no position to make my own medical decisions. And so he did. And when they opened me up, I had 1 unit of blood left in my body. So I was dying, and then they couldn't save much. So I had a postpartum hysterectomy, which is a really complicated surgery. But they did save my right ovary. So I was not in medical menopause, but woke up, in addition to having lost the twins, then was like, okay, now you're done. You lost the factory in the fire. It was a big loss. And I will say I had a 3rd living son by surrogate, and he's lovely. But part of why I want to talk about this is, as I've had some time to reflect on my experience, I have realized there was so much privilege baked into my survival. Had I not been in a big city, had I not delivered at a Trauma One hospital, had I not delivered somewhere that had a surgeon that was capable of doing that surgery, with me, not only did I survive, I wasn't in menopause, I wasn't disfigured. I mean, there's a lot of ways that could have gone wrong because your uterus is huge. There's a reason you don't operate. Had, frankly, I not been white, and had my husband maybe even not worked at that hospital, my survival was such on a razor's edge. Had any of those things been a little different, I die. And so it's really important to me to talk about this because I can be grateful that I'm all here, but then also need to say that what I was given is not available to other women, and it's going to be worse in the next 4 years and beyond. And I think people need to understand that reproductive care is a spectrum. We've siloed abortion off in a way where we don't see it as pertaining to other care. And the other thing that I've sort of realized, I always called the twins a medical induction of terminally ill twins, which is wordy, but also gave me a little linguistic cover. And after Dobbs, I was like, I think I had an abortion. And I don't even think that's a dirty word, and it still hadn't really occurred to me that that's what I had. And there are people in my family who still say, what you had was not an abortion. And the reason is because they understand why I did it. And they understand that I wanted those twins, because it's the wanted versus unwanted dichotomy too, as much as the good and the bad victim. And so part of me, and I think a lot of people who are TFMR parents, which is treat terminations for medical reasons, have had that sort of epiphany since then, that we need to talk about this in a way that we aren't ashamed, and we are entitled to our grief. And we are also entitled to speak openly about this experience in a way that is vulnerable and also doesn't make us pariahs.
Thank you for that. Colleen, would you be okay with sharing your story with listeners and your decision to include that in the book as well?
Yeah. So I think for both of us, we understood that this was a universe where we needed to have some credibility when we were speaking to people. So we wanted the people we were interviewing to understand that we were familiar with what they were going through. I think that's important in this because when you're asking someone to relive a really bad, terrible thing that happened to them, it's good to understand that the person you're talking to isn't going to ask a bunch of unnecessary questions. They're not going to say everything happens for a reason, which is something people always say to us. So I think that was why we chose to include it. We also, because we're sort of cold-hearted journalists, we also understand that if you divulge personal details, it also helps the reader get into the story. And we were really adamant about wanting to write a book that was something people would read. And so we needed to make it readable. And part of the way to do that, I think, is to sort of talk a little bit about your own personal experience. My personal experience was, I was about 6 months pregnant at our wedding. I was embarrassed. My husband was not. And I had put off the scans because we were getting married. And also this was New York City. I was living in New York City, and it was right around Superstorm Sandy. So everything was a big mess. And I'm a reporter, so I was really busy. So when we went to the scan, the baby had died. I had no idea why. I couldn't figure it out. I had just had this wedding where my dress didn't fit. I had to go at the 11th hour to get a dress that would just fit my body because I was so visibly pregnant. In my mind, I thought, that'll be a fun story to tell my kid someday. And, now I just sort of look at the pictures and think like, ugh. So I went to my doctor. She said that I could wait to deliver, but there was a risk of infection. The longer you wait to deliver, the more likely it is that you could develop some type of, infection in your uterus, or I could go to an abortion clinic, but there was kind of nothing in between really for me. So I went to the clinic because I was concerned about getting an infection. And I went there early in the morning. I was with my husband. We had to sort of walk past these protesters who were telling me that I was killing my baby. I was saying to my husband when we got into the lobby, do you think I should turn around and explain to them that I'm not killing my baby, that my baby is dead, that I wanted this baby and my baby is dead? And he was like, no, let's just go inside. It's okay. So, I had to have this 2-day procedure because another thing about D&C procedures is they're used in so many different medical procedures, including abortion, but abortion only up to a certain point. And then you have to have a more substantial procedure that is a 2-day procedure known as a D&E, which is a dilation and evacuation. And that's what I had. It's only available up until a certain point because, again, your body, it's just hard to manage the baby, basically. For me, I felt very embarrassed. I felt I had caused this because I was embarrassed about having the baby. You think all these dumb, crazy things. And I went on to have 2 other kids. I'm very lucky. I think my sort of mantra through all of this is, boy, I lucked out in this realm, particularly doing this research for this book and hearing all the ways in which it was just awful for so many people. I think I kind of got away a little easy. I didn't die. I didn't nearly die. Rebecca's shaking her head because this is something that I say a lot and it's ridiculous because everything's bad. What she's looking at me is because she wants to say everybody has bad experiences. There's no ranking order. And she's totally right. I think the other problem for me was no one helped me understand what was happening, what could happen in the future. The idea was just get rid of this one. You can always have another. And, later it became kind of hard because I didn't have anything. It was sort of like it didn't even exist. All I had was a medical bracelet and a sonogram. And when we moved to Washington, they got lost in the move. So I had nothing. And, I was working on a story about Hart Island in New York City, which is a potter's field where more than 1 million bodies are buried. And as it turns out, a lot of the bodies of COVID victims were there. And throughout hundreds of years, people have been put there when they can't afford a proper burial. The other thing is they bury stillbirths there. And so I thought maybe that the remains would have been buried there, but I can't find out because I don't have a death certificate. Had I delivered, I would have had a death certificate. But because I didn't, I don't have one, which is an interesting sort of bureaucratic problem. We sort of explore a little bit in the book about life and death certificates. But yeah, it's just a bummer. I don't know how else to say.
You mentioned something, and I'd like to hear this from both of you all, but you said, it's terrible when people say these sort of generic bromides, like everything happens for a reason and blah, blah, blah. Like, think of like the best and the worst things that people either said to you or said to people that you interviewed. Like, what was, of all the people you interviewed, what was the one thing where someone told you, and it's like, my God, I wish someone had said that to me. That's wonderful. And what are, say, the worst thing that you heard, either in your own personal experience or one of your interviewees? Start with you, Colleen, and we'll go to Rebecca.
Okay. So a plug for this book. We have an appendix in the back of the book called "Did You Seriously Just Say That to Me?" And it's a list of all of these things that people said, culled from our interviews, and why they're bad to say, and also examples of things that people could say or do instead. For me, personally, I got a lot of everything happens for a reason, which is very upsetting because what they're really saying to you is your baby was supposed to die. Sorry. Which, that sucks. In the interviews, I interviewed a woman who was really concerned about what was happening with her baby. She was surprised to be pregnant, but, excited. And there was something sort of amiss happening, and she couldn't quite figure out what was happening. And the doctors did tests, which she believed were hormone level testing, other sort of how to tell if your pregnancy is progressing testing. But she later found out that they had done drug testing on her. She's a Black woman. And she said, why would you test me for drugs? I don't know what's happening with my baby and I'm concerned. And the response was, well, you're probably going to lose the baby anyway. And we just want to know in case we need to be concerned about your other kids at home. And I
don't find that shocking, but it's
indicative, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes. And Rebecca, what were, say, one of the best things that people could say or have said to you, and what are some of the worst? One example of each.
Yeah, the best thing was really what someone did for me. My kids were 5 and 3, and after I lost the twins, I couldn't drive. I really had a long physical recovery, and in addition to just being emotionally devastated. And I had a friend who would come and she would say, I'm going to take the kids to the park. I'm going to take the kids for 3 hours and I'm going to feed them and I'll return at 2:00. And it was amazing because I knew I didn't have to worry about them. I knew when they were coming home, she didn't expect me to entertain her. And then I just had time because with the kids, I couldn't fall apart. So I sort of had time to fall apart or stare at the wall or just do nothing. And that was incredible. That was an incredible thing that she did. And she didn't ask me. She'd said, I'm going to come on Tuesday and get the kids. And I was like, great. And I think that was huge. It made such a difference in those first weeks. And it was good for them too, because our house was a bummer. I could barely walk. I wasn't playing with them. So that, I think the actions in the beginning and drop off food, I think not expecting somebody to either pour their heart out or expecting to fix it, both really help. I think the worst thing is, and this was said to me, I think it was said to Colleen and some people we talked to, is, are you still worried about that? Are you still thinking about that? I know the one woman we talked to, I think it had only been like 6 weeks. No time at all. The time in which people expect women to just get back on the horse is ridiculous. And sometimes, at 6 weeks, it's not even really physically possible. And I think, too, that we're uncomfortable with grief. We're uncomfortable with unhappy endings. We need that. You need to have another baby so we can tie a bow on this whole experience. And, we spoke to people who are never going to have a biological child. That isn't going to happen for them. And that is a real struggle because everyone in their life is, have you thought about IVF? Do you seriously think you're introducing the concept of IVF to anybody? So I think any kind of predictive statement or here's what you need to do is a mistake.
We're going to take a short break and we come back more about the personal and political conversations around reproductive rights. This is A Word with Jason Johnson. Stay tuned.
Time to move? Skip the hassles of selling during the holiday season and sell your home directly to Opendoor. Request an all-cash offer in minutes, close, and get paid in days. You can even pick your close date so you can move after New Year's. Start your move at opendoor.com or download the Opendoor app. Opendoor is represented by Opendoor Brokerage Inc., license 02061130 in California, and Opendoor Brokerage LLC in its other markets. Terms and conditions apply.
How do you feel great on vacation? Like really good? Easy. You go to Aruba. You'll spend your time relaxing on cool white sand beaches and floating in healing blue water. You'll immerse yourself in natural wonder and find your center on an island where things move at your speed. You won't just feel great, you'll feel relaxed, renewed, and ready for life. That's the Aruba effect. Plan your trip at aruba.com.
You're listening to A Word with Jason Johnson. Today, we're talking with Colleen Long and Rebecca Little about their book, I'm Sorry for My Loss, an urgent examination of reproductive care in America. You all began this book before the Supreme Court's Dobbs decision, and that obviously ended constitutional protections for abortion. Rebecca, what was it like for each of you to be doing this research at that time? Like, as you're seeing all of this fall apart, what was that like?
It was really emotional. It made the people we were speaking with so emotional. There were people we interviewed who were telling us these really personal stories about having to have terminations. So we talked to a woman in Kentucky who her child had no kidneys. So you can't survive with no kidneys. And she had to go to a clinic because the hospital that she was affiliated with was religious. So even though the child had a 0% chance of survival, she had to go to a clinic. And so she goes to the clinic, and because they had these laws, she was forced to look at the ultrasound and listen to the heartbeat. Then they said, you don't have to look, and we can give you headphones, but we are required to do this, which was an extra gut punch because she was so devastated. And then she also had to sign a piece of paper that said she refused to give the baby up for adoption. And she said, well, wait, did we miss something? We were told that our baby had a 0% chance of survival. And they said, no, this doesn't apply to you, but we can't proceed if you don't sign it. And it was just these extra traumas on top of just a really traumatic situation. And now in Kentucky, it's, none of what she did is even legal there anymore. And so these stories that already were pretty bad when we still had Roe just got so much more emotional and urgent. And, and we've seen that women are dying. And I think people don't understand pregnancy. I think people barely understand periods, at least people who are legislating them. What we call a heartbeat, it's not a cardiovascular system. It's an electrical impulse that will grow into a cardiovascular system and starting at about 12 weeks. And so there could be what we call a heartbeat on the screen in what is a pregnancy that is ending. So you could be having a miscarriage and you could be losing the supporting tissues, but you still have a flicker. That embryo or fetus has no chance of making it, but that woman's life is in danger. And, and as we've seen, can be deadly. And I don't know, I think actual Americans care. I don't know that all the politicians care. But I think talking about this, I think people just need a better understanding of pregnancy, and we don't talk about any of it because now these complications, I think people don't totally understand what's at stake.
Colleen, when you were talking to people and this change was going on, did you encounter people whose political ideology changed? Did you interview people who were like, after this experience in, this is 2022, 2023, I will change how I vote, or it changed their perspective on their religion, which influenced how they looked at politicians. Did you see anyone go through that sort of change because of these experiences?
I did. I talked to a lot of women for whom that resonated. I think, what we saw with the presidential election kind of play out is that women will vote perhaps for reproductive rights because, as 7 out of the 10 ballot initiatives in the recent election passed. But those states were not necessarily won by the presidential candidate who was championing reproductive rights. So, as it turns out, the corollary is not exact, and it's a little trickier than I initially perhaps thought it might be. Given we saw early wins in some congressional seats based on, women who were running on a reproductive rights platform. But that just didn't pan out in the way that certainly the Democrats had hoped in the 2024 presidential election. The other thing is when Roe fell, we were talking about this stuff. Rebecca and I were talking about the ways in which this is all a very gray area because we had sort of experienced the gray. But the sort of national conversation was really focused on losing access to the ability to end an unwanted pregnancy. I think now what we are increasingly seeing and what we were really sort of at the forefront of in our research is that these laws that were intended to restrict access to ending an unwanted pregnancy now have all of these massive repercussions for all kinds of reproductive health, not simply what we in sort of politically view as abortion in a very narrow way. The other thing that I've noticed since Roe fell, and really only very recently as we've seen sort of the effects of Roe appearing with women who are unable to get care women who are dying, women who are increasingly suffering, is a sort of shift in blame off of the politicians and onto the medical community, which is really interesting. There's sort of a growing idea that the doctors are somehow misinterpreting these laws or doing it. I heard one argument that they're doing it on purpose to make a progressive political argument. But we interviewed quite a lot of doctors, and all of those doctors were deeply concerned about the health and well-being of their patients. And they are also equally concerned about going to prison, which is a fair thing to be afraid of.
Rebecca, after working on this book and seeing what happened, as Colleen talks about, in 2022, where you had a lot of people who were successful running on access to prenatal care and everything else like that, were you surprised by the results in the elections, especially looking at women and in particular white women, the majority still coming out and supporting Donald Trump, despite what you had been encountering research-wise over the last couple of years? Did that surprise you at all? Or were you like, cognitive dissonance, whatever?
I was very surprised. I really was. And I need to stop making political prognostications because I am really not good at it. But the one thing that I kind of realize in retrospect is that I wonder if a lot of these ballot initiatives position themselves as abortion sort of being nonpartisan. And that was sort of how they campaigned on it. This is not a partisan issue. And I wonder if in a way that's how someone in Missouri voted to protect abortion, but also voted for Josh Hawley, who wants a national abortion ban, and Trump, who probably won't stand in the way of one. But I am very, very scared if, what we're seeing in Texas and Idaho and Mississippi is going to go nationwide, because it's going to have implications for everything in healthcare and not just for women, because 51% of med school graduates are now female, and those that are heterosexual will have a female partner, even though the male graduates, when you come out of med school, residency, fellowship, you are prime baby making age because you're finishing your training in your early 30s. Those doctors and their partners are not going to want to be patients in states that, depending on what happens, if it still becomes a state thing, they're not going to go to Texas and they're not going to go to Idaho. And so it just makes healthcare worse for people who live in those states. And it's a generational change. In 10 years, if it gets reversed, you're not uprooting your practice and moving. It's done. So I think there's a lot of knock-on effects that we have no idea yet of the full implications of them. And I'm very retired from baby making, but I would be very nervous to be pregnant right now.
I was trying to end the podcast on an optimistic note, but that's kind of hard to do, given the subject matter, given the political climate that we're in the country right now. But again, I found this book to be so moving and so compelling, and I've recommended it to several friends of mine who are doing this kind of work, who are working on documentaries about these kinds of issues. Just briefly from each of you to close, what's something that you want people to take away from this book? What's the thing where it's like, hey, you give it to your friend, you give it to the husband, the wife, the partner, whatever it is. This is what I want them to take from the book. We'll start with you, Colleen, and we'll finish with Rebecca.
Firstly, Jason, I am glad that you, a male, read this book. That is going to be my takeaway. I mean, this is a book that can be read for a subset of people for whom it will bring them, we hope, a modicum of understanding and comfort. However, we wanted the book to be a book that is read by everyone so that they can understand where we are and what is happening and why this is so complicated. We wanted to move beyond the political discussion and articulate the human cost and the human, the humanity of what is happening on the ground. And that is why we interviewed people. And that is why we put all of this stuff together in this book. It's a book that has history. It's a book that has chapters on how women are not studied medically. It has a chapter on the legal issues surrounding pregnancy loss and fetal personhood. And the reason we put all of this together was so that you could pick this book up, read it, and say, oh boy, okay, I understand what's happening. And now let's change our frame of mind. So I guess my takeaway would be it is not for just a subset. It's really, we tried to make it something that people all over would read. And we're so glad that you, a man, has read this book and you're recommending it to people. Amazing. We're so happy about it.
Thank you. Thank you. Rebecca.
You know, the one thing that I really hope people take away is that all of these areas of reproductive health care and pregnancy loss and maternal mortality, they're all related. We tend to talk about them very separately. We talk about abortion over here. We talk about miscarriage over here. Within the loss community, there tends to be stillbirth support groups, miscarriage support groups. And then the TFMR people, the terminations for medical reasons, are sort of off on their own. And then maternal mortality is over here. I think what I would love people to take away is that all of this is related. And I think the loss community has done a good job of that, kind of doing a big tent with support groups that don't necessarily separate people out. So you hear other people's perspectives. You know, we had spoken to some stillbirth moms who, once hearing from TFMR parents, it completely changed their outlook on abortion rights, essentially. And just to have, it creates empathy, first of all, but it also, I think, brings attention to how all of this is related. And so if you're talking about miscarriage, you have to talk about Black maternal health. If you're talking about stillbirth, you have to talk about how abortion rights affects miscarriage care. And I think just bringing all of that together in a more unified way would make a huge difference in how we have these discussions.
Rebecca Little and Colleen Long are the co-authors of I'm Sorry for My Loss, an urgent examination of reproductive care in America. This was an amazing conversation. Thank you all so much for coming and spending time with us today on A Word.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
And that's A Word for this week. The show's email is aword@slate.com. This episode was produced by Kristie Taiwo-Makanjuola. Alicia Montgomery is the vice president of audio at Slate. Our theme music was produced by Don Will. I'm Jason Johnson. Tune in next week for A Word.